folks, I gave you the opportunity to write down questions on little index cards and pass them in. And some of you folks took me up on that. And if you ever want to add to that, a text message, a phone call, email works great too. But I ran across one of the questions, and it kind of tied into this week. So I wanted to talk about it. One of the things that somebody wrote down was a word called something called the rapture. Has anybody ever heard this term before? Okay. Yeah, and how many of you have a basic understanding of what the rapture is? Well, you're way ahead of your pastor, because one of those things. I think the first time that I ever heard about it, all right, I was working at a church camp, and I was in college, and a co-counselor had a bumper sticker on her car, and on the back of it it said, I don't remember exactly, it said, in case of rapture, this car will be unoccupied. And I was like, I have no idea what that means. Because I was like, in case you're in love? That's what I thought about rapture. That was the only word that I knew. So I asked her about it, and she explained this whole thing to me, and I just really didn't understand what she was talking about. So now, after 4 years of seminary and 5 years of being a pastor, I'm still not entirely sure what the rapture is. All right, it is a word, and it shows up in one of our lessons today. And I'll do my best to kind of give you the gist, kind of the idea. Some Christians believe that the rapture is going to take place at the end of the world, all right, when Jesus comes back to the earth for a second time. And basically, how they understand the Bible is that that when Jesus is ready to come back, all the believers will be taken up, raptured, to be with Christ. All right, and so suddenly, and this is where that bumper sticker comes in. Suddenly cars will just be empty and just driving off the road. And clothes will fall. Evidently you don't go to heaven in your clothes, which I find a little weird, but that's, as our kids all pointed out, clothing very important. But chairs, like people at work, there will just be a pile of clothes sitting there. So that's, and some people will be taken and some will be left behind. And that's the general gist of it. And the reason that I bring this up is, one, because somebody asked about it. I figure we should preach about things people are interested in. And two, we are getting into the Sundays of the church year where we hear Jesus talking about the end times. All right, for the next several weeks, we are going to be in these kind of apocalyptic, end of the world, final judgment type stuff. And I don't know about you, but some of these stories can sound sort of scary and can be sort of frightening. And I'm like, this isn't the Jesus that I know. This lamp story that I hear, I'm like, it's kind of harsh that, they want in and you're like, nope, sorry. So what's going on with that? Some being chosen, some being locked out, some being left behind. And we hear today in our second lesson, and this is where I'm going to be preaching out of mainly, is we hear about Christians, dead and alive, being taken up into the air with Christ in our lesson from 1 Thessalonians. And this is actually one of the verses that gets used by Christians that believe in the rapture. They kind of stitch it together with another verse from 1 Corinthians, and they come up with this idea of people disappearing and being taken away. So, I thought it might be good for us to spend a little time talking and learning and thinking about the end of the world. All right? Because it's not something as Lutherans that we talk about a whole lot. I can remember going to church one it was about this time of year, and a pastor who I'd followed for a lot of years, I still consider him my pastor. He got up there in the morning and he said, well, we're closer to the end of the world than we've ever been before. And I wasn't paying all that much attention, and I was like, wait a second. I was like, he's not crazy. He's talking about the end of the world. And I thought it through what he was talking about, and yeah, we are. And this idea of the rapture and the apocalypse I think it's important to talk about because they have been made into popular books and popular movies. How many of you have read the Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth? Was that him? I think so. Yeah. And then we had Tim LaHaye and that group doing the Left Behind series, and they even made video games. I always wanted to get the video games. That's a whole other story. And some Christians have found these books and these movies to be very reassuring and very hopeful. And other Christians have found them frightening and kind of weird and scary. So I thought it might be helpful to talk about what we do know about the end of the world. All right, what we know for sure. Not much. There isn't a whole lot of information out there. You might remember in Mark's gospel, the disciples even asked Jesus. They get up and they say, "Hey Jesus, tell us when the end of the world is going to happen." And what is Jesus' response? He doesn't know. Jesus doesn't know. He says, "I don't know. Only the Father knows." If Jesus Christ, the only Son of the Father, does not know the timing and the details of the end of the world, what does that probably mean for biblical scholars, pastors, authors, you and me? Yeah, we have no idea. We can't know the timing or the details either. I think the temptation for well-meaning pastors, scholars, and Christians is to make guesses and to speculate what might happen because we know so little. Might we invent concepts and scenarios when we don't have all the answers? Perhaps the rapture, the idea of some people being taken and others being left behind, is one of those concepts. This idea hasn't been around very long. That's something that I want to point out too, is that the idea of the rapture, it got started in 1830. All right, so in biblical speak, that's like an eye blink. All right, and this guy named John Nelson Darby, and he created it, and then it got picked up in the early 1900s, and then they started kind of snowballing with that. And they put these verses from 1 Thessalonians with 1 Corinthians, and this is where we get the idea of this whole left behind thing. And yet, virtually no biblical scholars, nobody with a doctorate in front of their name, and very, very few churches, like actual church bodies, find the whole concept credible from a scriptural standpoint. All right, they pretty much say it's pretty dubious. So I want to go back to what we do know, rather than guessing at what we don't know. The second coming of Jesus, the apocalypse. All right, there's a couple things that we do know. It's something that's going to happen. All right? If something has a beginning, what also must it have? An end. We know this from flowers that raise in our garden. That's how the world works. And another thing that we know about it, Jesus told us that he was coming back. All right, sometimes at communion we do this thing where I say, and I'm going to ask you to play along, I say, Christ has died, Christ has risen,
Christ will rise again.
Christ will come again. So Jesus tells us that he's coming back, which Jesus' promises are usually pretty good promises. He says, I'm going to rise from the dead. He rises from the dead. So we know that these are good promises. And lastly, most important though, is the return of Christ is good news. All right? So many books, so many movies have made it bad news. All right? Or scary news. And the point, so the big point in Thessalonians, the last verse, look at your scripture there, the last verse in that read. What does Paul say, the reason for writing this? Encouragement. It's not to terrify people. It's not to scare people into believing. It's to encourage them. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. The promise of Christ's return is to give us hope. Paul is writing this letter to a church as its pastor. All right? The Thessalonians had lost people. They had loved ones die, family, friends, and they were afraid that if these people had died, they'd somehow get left out. of the resurrection. And Paul says, no, Jesus is Lord and Savior of both the dead, verse 14, and the living, verse 17. All will be saved. None will be left behind. And last week we remembered and celebrated and mourned the saints of St. Peter Lutheran Church who have passed away this year. It's their absence that makes us sad. It's not necessarily death that makes us sad, but death, it creates this absence. And we get lonely. We miss the people. Like all living things, we have a beginning. We also have an end. And we fear the loneliness of that loss. This is what the Thessalonians are dealing with. Paul is not trying to tell people exactly what the final judgment day will look like or how it'll work. That's not what he's doing here. Paul is preaching a funeral sermon of hope to people who are sad, people who are like us, who have lost people that we love. God promises them and us that Jesus' resurrection was not a one-time deal. It was the beginning of the resurrection of all people. God promises us that death is no longer the final word, no longer the end. Instead, someday, we don't know when, and we certainly don't know how, God will bring us all back together again. And this is going to be a really cool place. All right, I got a question from one of my confirmation kids about heaven. And he said, what's heaven going to be like? And I said, I don't know, but it's going to be awesome. All right? Because there isn't going to be cancer. There aren't going to be car accidents. There won't be injustice or bullying or name-calling. There'll be no suffering. Grandparents and grandchildren back together again. Siblings, brothers and sisters separated for years. Relatives, friends. All of us will be together again. So again, and this is the last time, what are we sure about with Jesus' second coming? What do we know for certain about Jesus' return? We don't know when, and we don't know how. And it's good news. It's great news. Knowing these two truths and trusting in God's promises, what does this allow us to do? How does this then allow us to live our lives? I mean, if you think about it, so much money has been made by authors and filmmakers making us afraid of the end of the world, afraid of Jesus coming back. We don't have to worry or be afraid anymore because God promises through our baptism that we are all going to be with God forever. No one will be getting left behind, whether it's tomorrow or 1,000 years. It doesn't matter because it's going to be so good. So if we no longer have to be afraid of the future, what can we do now? We don't have to try and use energy to decipher when Jesus is coming back because we know it's not possible to do so. We don't have to fear Jesus coming back because it's the King who forgives sinners, who heals the sick and feeds the hungry. That's the King that's coming back, not an angry, wrathful God. Therefore, we can focus on living our lives now, serving our neighbors now, loving our God now. We don't have to live in the future or worry about the future because that's taken care of in Jesus Christ. Before Jesus left this earth, he gave his church, his disciples, you and me, a job to do. He gave us a new commandment while we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to be doing while we're waiting. And he says, you are to love God and love your neighbors as yourselves. We show our love for God when we worship. We show our love for God when we study the Bible with others. We show our love for God by sharing our time and our talents and our finances with those who are in need. We show our love for our neighbors when we give forgiveness to someone who hasn't even asked for it. We show our love for our neighbors when we volunteer in our churches and in our communities. We show our love for our neighbors when we treat all we meet with dignity and respect, even if we don't agree with them. I want to do something with you all this week, and I don't know if you're willing to, but I think it could be interesting. All right? I want to invite you all to share other ways that you think of loving God and loving your neighbor. And what I want to invite you to do is share the big and ways that you do it, or big and little ways that you do it, or the ways that people do it for you. And what I would ask you is take a picture. All right, and you can post it on Facebook and tell a story. Or if you don't do it that way, you can write a story and email it to me or call me and tell me that story, and I'll tell that story in the community as well. You know, if you write down a story and tell us how you see God in your daily life. How do we love God? How do we love our neighbors? Since we don't have to worry or be afraid of our future, how can we live, love, and serve now? Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.